beheaded 2 wives, killed over 70,000 people, burned monks alive and rewrote God's law to suit his desire. Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was judge, priest, and executioner in one bloated body. Behind the royal portraits lies a trail of severed heads and broken oaths. This is not a tale of glory, this is blood in a crown. He wasn't meant to rule, not at first. When Henry Tudor was born in 1491, all eyes were on his older brother Arthur, the Prince of Wales, heir to the Tudor legacy, and the boy groomed to inherit a kingdom that had just emerged from decades of bloody civil war. Henry, by contrast, was a second son, a spare, a shadow, a soul destined for the church, and that was not a misfortune, not yet. As a child, young Henry was groomed not for the sword, but for scripture. He was immersed in the humanist education of the Renaissance, fluent in Latin, fond of poetry, steeped in theology, and naturally gifted in music and debate. His tutors spoke of his bright mind, his curiosity, and his moral compass. He was a boy of promise, eloquent and graceful, charming to courtiers and clergy alike. To many who saw him then, he seemed more like a bishop in princely robes than a future king. They called him handsome, golden-haired, athletic, brilliant at jousts and hunting, a natural with instruments. His laughter filled halls, and his piety filled chapels. He fasted during Lent, gave generously to the poor, and could speak with theologians as easily as he could with poets. He was adored, and for a while he adored the world back. But fate, like a hidden knife, turned, and the blade fell not on him, but on his brother. In 1502, Arthur died suddenly, just months after marrying Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess sent to seal an alliance between empires. The kingdom mourned, the alliance wavered, and everything that had been prepared for Arthur was now forced upon Henry. At age 10, the second son became the heir. It was not just a transfer of titles, it was the death of a future and the birth of another, forged not by choice but by royal necessity. Almost overnight, the boy meant for the church was drawn into the machinery of kingship. He was pulled from the shadows and reshaped in his brother's mould. He would now be the one to marry Catherine. He would be the one to produce heirs. He would be the one to carry the burden of the dynasty. Some said he loved Catherine from the beginning. Others say he saw her as duty dressed in silk. Regardless, in 1509, at age 17, Henry married her. The Spanish princess, once promised to his brother, became queen beside the young golden prince. The court celebrated, the people rejoiced, and for a moment it seemed that God had simply swapped one brother for another, as though divine will had always intended it this way. But destiny, when rewritten by human hands, often begins to rot from the edges, because beneath the splendour of the wedding and the hymns of coronation, something fragile had already been set in motion. A union born from compromise, cloaked in theology, and bound not by passion, but by politics and papal permission. Henry was now king, but he was also still the boy who once studied saints, who sang in chapels, who wrote verses to God. For a few years he tried to be both, a ruler with virtue, a man of strength and soul. He waged little war, he read widely, he ruled with idealism, but the church that raised him would one day be torn apart by his hand, and the queen he once married with public joy would become the symbol of his deepest discontent, all because she could not give him a son, and Henry, as the king, the man, the boy still chasing God, would not accept that silence from heaven. From this point forward, love would become transaction, faith would be weaponized, and the boy meant for God would become the king who played him. He entered the throne room like sunlight through stained glass. 17 years old, towering, roaring, radiant, the very image of youth sculpted into flesh and draped in silk and gold. His hair gleamed auburn beneath a velvet crown. His limbs, long and muscular, moved with ease in the armour of kingship, and when he smiled, courtiers forgot their lines, and ministers forgot their plans. Henry VIII was everything England had longed for. After decades of civil war and the iron rule of his father, Henry VII, a king who counted coins more carefully than blessings, the realm now embraced a boy king who laughed openly, spent freely, and ruled as if joy were his birthright. He danced, he hunted, he jousted and composed songs, he studied languages and scripture with equal delight. He rewarded the loyal, dazzled ambassadors and charmed noble women into speechless awe. To the people, he was not merely a monarch, he was the dream of a golden age finally come to life. And standing beside him was Catherine, graceful, educated, pious. Older, yes, but full of dignity. She had waited years in limbo after Arthur's death. Now she was queen, Now England had its royal couple, a Catholic, chivalric Renaissance pair. Together they looked ordained, and for a time the marriage seemed happy. Henry truly cared for Catherine in those early years. He admired her wisdom, trusted her counsel, and respected her royal lineage. She governed wisely when he went abroad. She brought with her the weight of Spain, the blessing of the Pope, and the hopes of a continent. But even the brightest dawn casts a long shadow behind it. Catherine's first pregnancy brought joy, and then despair. The son they had prayed for lived only a few weeks. More pregnancies followed. Some ended in miscarriage, others in stillbirth. Only one child, a girl named Mary, survived infancy. Henry was devastated and humiliated. A king without a son was a king without a future. The Tudor dynasty was still young, its bloodline fragile. The Wars of the Roses had taught England that uncertain succession bred rebellion, war, and death. Henry began to brood. He told himself it was not his fault. He searched the scriptures. He found the verse in Leviticus, the one that said, "If a man takes his brother's wife, he shall be childless." And the seed of doubt sprouted in his mind. Had he defied God by marrying Catherine? Was their union cursed? Was Mary, though alive, the proof of divine disapproval? He wrestled with these questions in silence at first, but over time they consumed him. Every cradle that stood empty seemed like a message from heaven, every miscarriage a punishment, and as Catherine aged, her skin paler, her body weary, Henry looked elsewhere. He still jousted, still wrote music, still staged pageants. But his eyes had changed. They no longer lit with innocent wonder. They narrowed, calculated, searched. It was no longer enough to be loved by the people, admired by scholars, or praised by God. He wanted more. He wanted legacy. He wanted a son. And the eternal stamp of authority that came with it. And in that hunger, the boy who had once smiled like a saint began to think like a sovereign who could not be denied. He believed he had done everything right. He had honoured his duty, married the woman his father gave him, prayed, fasted, ruled fairly. But now, after years of devotion and disappointment, Henry began to feel that perhaps righteousness was no longer enough. Perhaps it was time to make his own miracles. She did not kneel. Anne Boleyn did not beg, blush, or flutter her lashes like the other women who floated through court on painted smiles and whispered hopes. She walked like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to become. She met the king's gaze and did not look away. She spoke in riddles and French, laughed at the wrong moments, and wore black when everyone else wore silk, because she was dangerous, not because she seduced him, but because she refused him. Henry was used to obedience, to submission wrapped in perfume. Mistresses came and went, offering soft devotion and quieter children. But Anne brought fire to the altar. She did not want to be adored. She wanted to be queen, and that made her irresistible. By the late 1520s, Henry was no longer just a husband with a failing marriage. He was a king desperate for an heir, a man drowning in unspoken rage, and a soul convinced that God had withdrawn his favour. Catherine, now over 40, was no longer capable of bearing children. Her womb, once the hope of the dynasty, had become its tomb. And so Henry found his reason. Anne became not just a woman, but a cause. To have her, he would need to end his marriage. To end his marriage, he would need to break with Rome. To break with Rome, he would need to unmake the very church that had crowned him, and he did. He petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment, claiming his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God. But the Pope, held hostage by politics, and Catherine's nephew, Lear, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused. For 6 years, Henry waited, pleaded, argued. Then he lost patience. In 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in secret, and in doing so he detonated centuries of religious order. Within months, he forced the English clergy to declare him the supreme head of the Church of England. He rejected papal authority. He rejected Rome. He rewrote law with Parliament's trembling ink, dissolved the Queen's title, and crowned Anne. Anne was pregnant, and Henry was certain it was a boy, but it wasn't. Elizabeth was born in September. Healthy, sharp-eyed, unwanted, Henry tried to hide his disappointment, but the silence between him and Anne began immediately. She miscarried in 1534, again in 1535, and one more time, perhaps the final blow, in 1536. That child, some claimed, had been a boy. Henry's fury returned. but this time it turned toward the woman he had once torn down a kingdom to possess. Anne, for her part, had made enemies fast. She was bold, opinionated, and unrepentant. She mocked courtiers, argued with bishops, threatened those who insulted her daughter. She was a queen who did not know fear, and in a palace built on fear, that was fatal. In May 1536, Anne was arrested. She was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, all capital crimes. Among the accused was her own brother. The charges were flimsy, the evidence absurd. But it didn't matter. 5 men were executed. Anne followed. She went to the scaffold dressed in grey. She knelt. She forgave. A French swordsman was summoned. Swift, precise, foreign. The blade struck ye once. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Anne had been a fire. Now she was ash. And Henry, who once claimed to love her more than life, never spoke her name again. He wanted silence. And he made it law. After Anne's execution, the realm held its breath, not from grief, but from fear. Something had changed in Henry VIII. The golden prince who once danced in tournaments was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer tolerated hesitation, disagreement, or memory. Those who questioned him were not argued with. They were erased. The crown now sat heavier and sharper. In 1534 he passed the Act of Supremacy. It declared the king, and only the king, the supreme head of the Church of England, not the Pope, not God's vicar, not any man in Rome. To deny it, even in private, was treason. To speak against it was death. But it wasn't enough to obey in action. Henry demanded hearts, minds, and oaths. He required every noble, priest, and commoner to swear allegiance, not just to the law, but to the belief that he alone was God's chosen voice. And when people refused, he showed them what a silent God looks like. Sir Thomas More had once been Henry's friend, a brilliant humanist, philosopher, and Lord Chancellor. He had played music with the king, dined beside him, debated scripture for hours under candlelight. But when asked to endorse the king's supremacy over the church, More refused, quietly, respectfully, without protest. It didn't matter. More was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and eventually condemned for treason. On July 6, 1535, he was beheaded. As he mounted the scaffold, he spoke not against the king. He only whispered that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first. It was not enough. The axe still fell, and it would fall again and again and again. Dozens of monks who refused the oath were dragged from their abbeys and hanged in chains. Some were drawn and quartered, their bodies torn apart while still breathing. Others were left to rot at the city gates as warnings. Silence your conscience, or we will silence it for you. The king's laws were no longer just about order. They were about obedience. Even Parliament, now filled with flatterers and fearful men, passed the Treasons Act, a law so sweeping that any word, gesture, or look that imagined harm toward the king could be treated as high treason. To speak out was suicide. To stay silent could be too. And all the while Henry smiled. He dined in palaces seized from monasteries. He wore cloth of gold woven from the melted treasures of abbeys. He hunted on lands that once belonged to the poor and the cloistered. What began as a divorce had become a revolution, not of faith, but of power. The Reformation in England was not led by theologians or martyrs. It was written in royal decrees, signed with trembling hands, and enforced by sharpened steel. Every altar broken, every relic burned, every voice that once prayed in Latin, now silenced or rewritten in English, with the king's name replacing God's. And still, rebellions stirred in the north, whispers in Yorkshire, murky chants in Lincolnshire. Henry heard them and sharpened his axe. Anne gave him a daughter, and 3 miscarriages. None of them were sons, none of them were enough. Henry had torn the church in half to marry her. He had risked excommunication, defied the Pope, executed friends, and rewritten the soul of England, all for the promise of a male heir. And that promise had turned to ash. The crown she had once worn with triumph now felt heavier than iron. The same courtiers who once flattered her now whispered behind her back, and the king, once drunk with desire, now looked at her with cold calculation. Anne Boleyn was clever. Too clever. She had enemies in every corner of court, and worst of all, she had failed at the one thing queens were kept alive to do. By 1536, Henry's affection had curdled into suspicion. He withdrew, grew sullen, angry, unpredictable, and Anne, sensing the shifting winds, tried to fight back with the only weapons she had left: wit, charm, and defiance. It wasn't enough. That spring, rumours began to spread. Anne was said to be too familiar with her male attendants, too bold, too flirtatious, too powerful. Then came the accusations: adultery, incest, and treason. 5 men were named, including her own brother. No real evidence was offered. No motive made sense, but it didn't matter. The king wanted a reason, and now he had one. Anne was arrested in May, dragged from her chambers in shock, locked in the tower where she had once celebrated her coronation. She wrote letters, she pleaded, she prayed, she maintained her innocence with dignity and fear. The trial was a spectacle, a queen accused of crimes unthinkable, a courtroom filled with enemies, a verdict decided before the first question was asked. All 5 men were executed. Anne followed days later. She chose a French swordsman, quicker than the English axe. She wore a grey gown and a crimson underdress. Her final words were calm, perhaps rehearsed. She did not accuse, she did not scream. She only asked that God bless the king. On May 19th, 1536, she knelt on the scaffold. The sword struck clean, and just like that, Anne Boleyn, the most powerful woman in England, was gone. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The court was silent. The people watched. The message was clear. Queens were not wives, they were wombs, and when they failed, they were replaceable. Anne's name was erased from records, her crest torn down, her portraits removed, her memory treated as poison. But the daughter she left behind, Elizabeth, would one day remember. She would remember everything. It began with a march, then it became a flood. In the autumn of 1536, as the leaves blackened and fell like ash across the north of England, tens of thousands of men rose in rebellion, not for power, not for glory, but for faith, for land, for the world they once knew, and the world Henry had destroyed. They called it the Pilgrimage of Grace. Farmers, monks, nobles, tradesmen, men who had once sworn loyalty to the king, now walked with swords in their hands and crucifixes stitched to their tunics. Their demands were clear: restore the monasteries, free the imprisoned clergy, reunite England with Rome. Henry had promised to protect the church. Instead, he had stripped it bare. From 1536 to 1541, he ordered the dissolution of more than 800 religious houses, monasteries, abbeys, priories, and convents. These were not just buildings of prayer. They were hospitals, orphanages, granaries, libraries. They fed the poor, they housed the elderly, they educated the forgotten, and now they burned. Stone by stone they were gutted. Gold and silver were torn from altars, windows shattered, books thrown into rivers, tombs ransacked. The monks who resisted were hanged from trees, the nuns were cast into the streets, and the land, the sacred soil of centuries, was seized and sold to men loyal to the king. The North watched all of this in silence, until silence became unbearable. Led by lawyer Robert Asker, the Pilgrimage of Grace surged with more than 30,000 men. It was the largest uprising Henry would ever face. But they came not as conquerors. They wore white crosses, carried banners of Christ, and swore that they rose not against the king, but against his counsellors, against the evil whisperers, against the false reformers. Henry, ever the performer, sent messages of peace. He promised pardons, promised to listen, promised mercy. They believed him. The rebels disbanded, returned home, laid down their weapons, and Henry, calm, smiling, victorious, made his final promise: they would pay. Within weeks, his army descended on the north. Hundreds were arrested. Asker was captured and dragged in chains to the tower. He was tried in secret, convicted without defence, and in July 1537 he was hanged from the walls of York, his body left to rot as a warning. Alongside him, over 200 others were executed: priests, gentlemen, widowers, sons. It was not war, it was slaughter. A cold, methodical purge of anyone who dared remember a world before Henry's godhood. The monasteries remained closed, their land absorbed, their people scattered, their memory erased. Henry returned to London, to his tapestries, his feasts, his sunless throne, and the north, once red with banners of peace, now ran red with blood. What had started as a call for justice ended in mass graves. Because Henry VIII had learned something valuable, mercy could be feigned, but power, true power, was proven in the bodies of the obedient. She gave him a son, and then she died. Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, had done what Catherine and Anne could not. In 1537, she delivered a living, breathing boy, Edward, the long-awaited male heir, the answer to every prayer and every execution. Henry wept when the child was placed in his arms. He called him his miracle, his legacy. But joy, like so much else in Henry's reign, came blood-stained. Jane died just 12 days after childbirth, pale, fevered and broken. The court fell into mourning. Henry dressed in black and refused to remarry for years. He spoke of her as his only true wife, the one who had given him what he wanted most. But grief for Henry was not paralysis, it was pause. By 1540, his advisers, led by Thomas Cromwell, encouraged him to take another wife, this time a Protestant match. Anne of Cleves, sister of a German duke, politically convenient in a Europe now fractured by the Reformation. Henry agreed, sight unseen. When Anne arrived in England, Henry disguised himself to surprise her, a romantic gesture gone terribly wrong. She did not recognise him. She did not bow, and when she did realise who he was, her reaction was tepid, distant, disappointed. Henry was humiliated. He called her a Flanders mare, refused to consummate the marriage, claimed impotence, and within 6 months the union was annulled. Anne survived. She lived in comfort, referred to as the king's sister. She was lucky. Catherine Howard, who followed her, was not. Young, lively, barely 19. She danced through court like a candle flickering too close to the edge. Henry, by then middle-aged, bloated and ulcered, was besotted. He called her his rose without a thorn, but the petals soon wilted. Rumours surfaced of affairs, both before and during the marriage, whether true or not no longer mattered. The machinery of accusation turned quickly. In 1542, Catherine was arrested, interrogated and condemned. She confessed to lightness, not treason. But Henry's wrath did not distinguish. She was executed that same year. Witnesses claimed she practiced laying her head on the block the night before. When the axe fell, the court fell silent. Another queen lost to a king who could no longer be loved without fear. And then came Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, a widow, wise, devout, diplomatic. She soothed the aging monarch. She cared for his children. She even debated theology with him, carefully, cautiously. She nearly lost her life when her religious writings drew suspicion, but she bowed just enough to survive. The court by now was a haunted place. Whispers moved through its corridors like smoke. No one laughed too loudly, no one lingered too long. The axe had become an extension of the throne, always waiting. Even Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most loyal architect, the man who had dissolved the monasteries, arranged Anne of Cleves, built the scaffolding of royal supremacy, was not safe. After Anne's failed marriage embarrassed the king, Cromwell was arrested, charged with treason, condemned without trial. He was beheaded in July 1540. On the very same day, Henry married Catherine Howard. Life and death, love and loss, signed in ink, executed in blood. The cycle continued. Henry once filled his court with music. Now it echoed with the silence of those afraid to speak. Wives passed like seasons, ministers vanished, and still the king remained, more shadow than man, ruling through absence, fear, and the sharp certainty of steel. By the 1540s, the king no longer walked. He was wheeled. His legs, once strong enough to crush lances and thunder through tourneys, had become infected, swollen, and ulcerated. The stench, they said, preceded him. His boots filled with pus. His servants packed the wounds with rags soaked in wine and myrrh. But nothing stopped the rot. Flies hovered near him in summer. No window stayed closed long enough to trap the smell. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. A crane was built to lift him into bed. Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, had decayed into something monstrous, a breathing corpse clothed in velvet and rage. His mind too was rotting. Paranoia became his closest advisor. He trusted no one. He accused ministers of treason for hesitating in their words. He revised his will over and over. He watched his courtiers with cold, suspicious eyes. Even his remaining wife, Catherine Parr, tread lightly, smiling just enough, praying just loudly enough to survive. Those who had known him in youth could not recognize what sat on the throne now. His beard had gone grey, his teeth blackened. His hands, once used to compose love songs, now trembled with pain and fury. He lashed out at his doctors, fired his cooks, and struck servants in fits of bitterness. No one corrected him, no one dared. He was not old, not yet 50, but his body had aged beyond its years. Food could not satisfy him, sleep did not calm him, power had poisoned him from within. Still he ruled. He signed warrants, he ordered executions, he named heirs and annulled alliances. He still believed himself the chosen vessel of God, even as his flesh dripped from the bone. But what haunted him most was the question of succession. He had a son, Edward, frail, pale, often ill, a thin flame in a cold wind. Henry obsessed over the boy's safety. He ordered new palaces. He wrote volumes of instructions. He dreamed of a dynasty that would wash away the bloodstains left behind. But he knew, deep down in the quiet hours between midnight and morphine, he knew that the kingdom he would leave behind was splintered, torn by religion, haunted by death, governed by fear. He tried to control it with law. In 1543 he passed the Third Succession Act, restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of inheritance, but still placed Edward above them. It was not out of fairness, it was desperation. He could not afford another war, but he had already sown the seeds for one. The church was fractured, the nobles divided, the people exhausted, and Henry, once the boy with a golden smile, now spent his final days dragging his bloated body across marble floors, held up by servants who dared not meet his eyes. He gave fewer audiences, held fewer councils, slept surrounded by holy relics, hoping they would forgive what he had done in God's name. Even his dreams, they said, were violent. In one, he screamed for a son who no longer answered. In another, he wandered through burning monasteries, calling for a queen, but couldn't remember which one. He lived longer than most expected, longer than many hoped. But by 1546, death circled close. His skin blistered, his eyes sank, his voice cracked into whispers and threats, and yet still he clutched his crown, not because it gave him strength, but because it was all that remained. The king had become a tomb, and inside it, something was still breathing. He died alone. On January 28, 1547, in the faded splendour of Whitehall Palace, Henry VIII took his final breath. No fanfare, no whispered prayers, no crowds beneath his window pleading for his healing. Just the creaking of the bed, the murmur of frightened servants, and the low, stuttering rasp of a man who had once believed himself God. The room was hot, airless. His body had swollen grotesquely. The ulcer on his leg, long hidden behind layers of scented cloth, had grown black with infection. He could barely speak, could not rise, could not be touched without pain. No bishop anointed him in his last hours, no confessor arrived in time. His final words, if there were any, were not recorded. Silence swallowed him, and then he was gone, but his body refused to behave. During the funeral procession, as his massive, decaying corpse was transported to Windsor, the coffin began to leak. Blood and fluid seeped through the wood, and according to some chroniclers, whether truth or myth, dogs were seen licking the trail along the stone floor. The image haunted England. A king whose sins refused to stay buried, a body rotting before it touched the ground. He was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a son, and the only one he ever seemed to mourn. Not Catherine, not Anne, not the girl queen he sent to the block, only Jane. There was no great national mourning, no masses of weeping citizens, no outpouring of grief. To the court his death was a logistical concern, to the people it was a release. The nation he left behind was not united, it was cracked. The Church of England stood, yes, but blood still stained its foundation. The monasteries were gone, their ruins echoing with the wind. The poor wandered farther, the nobles plotted quietly, the fear remained. Henry had forged a legacy, but not a peace. His only son, Edward VI, was crowned, a boy of 9, frail in body, brilliant in mind, but the kingdom would not stay his for long. Within a decade he would be dead. His sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, would inherit not just a crown but a curse. Henry's image was polished in portraits, the chest puffed, the legs spread, the eyes fixed on eternity. But behind the paint was a different truth, a man who changed the shape of a nation, and did so with fire, a ruler who turned faith into punishment, a husband who killed his wives, a reformer who broke not just from Rome, but from reason, a king who saw no difference between his own will and God's. He had once been the embodiment of youth and promise. But by the end he was only weight, on the throne, in the court, In the memory of all who survived him, no elegies were sung from the heart. No one dared speak too fondly or too harshly. Henry VIII had ruled not with love, but with fear, and when fear dies, the silence left behind is not mourning, it is relief. He is remembered by the wives, 6 of them, like chapters in a tragedy written in blood and lace. 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 died in childbirth, 1 survived him, barely. But the wives are only the beginning, not the whole story, not the whole cost. Over 70,000 people were executed under Henry VIII's reign, by sword, by fire, by rope, by law, twisted into terror. Nobles, monks, peasants, friends, women who loved too boldly, men who prayed too slowly, ideas that dared to outlive his own. He reshaped England. Yes, but not with enlightenment, not with mercy. He did it with walls torn down, relics smashed and voices silenced. He turned religion into government, and government into revenge. He took the church not to set it free but to place it in his pocket. He crowned himself the voice of God, then punished those who couldn't hear him clearly enough. Even now, history wrestles with his name. Some call him a visionary, the architect of the English Reformation, the king who broke Rome and gave birth to modern monarchy. But to call him great is to forget too much. To admire his crown is to ignore the gallows it stood upon, because Henry VIII did not build a legacy. He carved a warning. You get laws that kill for silence, though, faith that bows for survival, and power that eats itself from the inside out. I believe history has tried too hard to forgive him. The portraits soften him. The textbooks round off his edges. We remember the music, the poetry, the opulence. But the people who died under his signature, they left no paintings, only empty fields, crumbling abbeys, and graves without names. He began as a golden prince. He ended as a bloated shadow. And in between he traded love for power, God for control, and conscience for convenience. So no, I don't call him great. I call him a man who destroyed what he could not master, who rewrote the laws to fit the shape of his desire, who set his kingdom so thoroughly that even his death was met with stillness, not sorrow. He ruled not just a throne, he ruled a mirror, and what stared back was never England, it was himself.